Hi there, class. Here I am at Georgetown University in the heart of our nation's capital. Um, as I told you on Friday, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be with you for the next couple of classes, but at least we can, do some work this way, even if you don't get to participate the way I would like you to. Today's topic is ethics. Now, I teach a whole course on ethics, so this is something that I'm going to be really abbreviating for you guys, but I think it's an important area of philosophy and one that is probably actually really practical for you. Every area, whether you're going into something with medicine or business or education, or there's always some ethics involved. So it's useful to know a little bit about ethics and the background. First thing is to think about what ethics actually is. People tend to think about it in terms of morality, right? And there is definitely a connection between ethics and morals. Some philosophers would disagree on this, but I think there's a general consensus that when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about morality, but not about God. In other words, we're trying to say, what can we know based on logic rather than based on scripture? And no matter what the scripture is, for that matter. So we're not necessarily just talking about the Bible, but what can we know? So how do we tell right from wrong if there is, no definite rules that God has given us? There are lots of answers to that, and there's lots of different answers to that. For us, for now, we're going to start with one of the most important thinkers in terms of Western philosophy, and certainly one of the biggest names in philosophy, which is Aristotle. Now, Aristotle lived about 2,500 years ago, and he was Greek. He was a student of Plato who really disagreed with Plato on lots of things, even though they had a good relationship with each other. He wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics is perhaps one of the most important books ever written about the topic of ethics, and there's not a good way to start without starting with that. The first thing you have to understand for Aristotle is his conception of what it means to be human. So, for Aristotle, what does it mean to be human? Well, he says that humanity has what he called like the tripartite soul. That is to say, our souls are in three parts. Now, this isn't a religious idea of soul. And in fact, we don't necessarily in English have a good word for what he meant when he said soul. Maybe it would be better to talk about it as like our principle of life, like what makes us living beings, and then specifically what makes us a specific type of living being. So the first level of soul and the most basic level of soul that Aristotle thinks humanity possesses is what we would call maybe the vegetative soul. Okay, and so we want to think about what plants can do. So plants can reproduce. Okay, they can grow, they can decay. Plants grow, they produce waste, they do all sorts of things. Okay, that we are also capable of doing. And they are, according to Aristotle and what he would have known, because they didn't know about, unicellular organisms and things like that, that would have been like the most basic form of life for him. And so when you talk about the like basis for the soul as a life principle, the way Aristotle talks about it, it is to say that, okay, our souls are, alive because they can do things that a plant does. Okay. So, a plant can reproduce. Okay. Humans can reproduce. Now, plants reproduce, generally speaking, asexually. Humans produce sexually, but it's still reproduction. We grow the same way plants grow, except that they use photosynthesis and we eat stuff. We also decay, okay? Your skin falls off and, all the time. I mean, I'm not talking about, you're dead and your skin is like decaying, but like our skin, like, you brush it off and like there's skin cells everywhere. So, plants do that. They, we see every autumn, like they lose their leaves and then they grow new ones. And so there is this like pattern of growth and decay that is part of what it means to be alive. Okay. They consume things just as we do. And if you think about people who are in sort of long-term comas or have brain damage, we sometimes call them vegetables, right? Okay. Now, they're still human beings. We're not saying that somebody in a permanently vegetative state isn't still human. Okay. It's just that their powers are reduced to basically what a plant can do. So they are, and actually, like, it's still possible to reproduce. Just, I mean, this has happened. There have been women who were pregnant and then got into comas and still delivered their babies. So it is possible to reproduce, even if you are in a vegetative state, okay? Like your sexual organs still work, all of that stuff. So we can do everything that he would say a plant can do, okay, in that, vegetative state. Now, the second level of soul, we might call the animalistic soul, but it would be more accurate to call it like the emotive soul. And if you think about animals, and this is certainly true of our understanding of like animal psychology, you have very basic animals like worms, okay, and very complex animals like gorillas, okay. But worms seem to feel something. Okay. If anybody here has gone fishing, for example, you put a worm on a hook and it starts like wriggling around, okay? It has some instinct for self-preservation. And so there is like basic instincts, at least, that, animals have. But then those instincts grow even more than that. So as the animal kingdom gets more complex, and we're talking about more complex animals, they have other levels of like comprehension, other levels of emotion. So elephants, for example, like mourn their dead. Okay. Actually, a number of animals seem to mourn their dead. So if you ever have a sheep and it gives birth to a lamb and the lamb dies, the sheep will sometimes actually be quite depressed about that. So there seems to be like some level of emotion that goes into like being an animal. That emotion is often instinctual. Okay. Now, that is not to say that your like dog doesn't love you, okay? Like maybe your dog loves you. But why does your dog love you? Well, you're the person who takes care of it. You give the dog, food, you give it treats, you take it on walks, right? And so like, yes, like do I think my dog Henry loves me and he's kind of actually upset that I am not home right now? It's still the fact that, like, I'm his person. Like, I'm the one who takes care of him. So he is attached to me, but he's attached to me specifically because, like, I do stuff for him. And so there is, like with the worm, some level of like self-preservation there. Very similarly, there is, like, as we were talking about with plants, there's asexual reproduction. Animals, generally speaking, have sexual reproduction. And that, like, is another instinctual level. So, we have people. Okay. And you might know somebody like this because I think this is like fairly common in college, who, like, for whatever reason become like hypersexualized and like start sleeping with lots of people. Okay. Um I'm not here to talk about the ethics of that, okay? But I am here to talk about like our perception of that. Okay. There is something, I think, the more people do that, the in some ways the less human we regard them. Okay. Because it's more animalistic. So, a guy who sleeps around, okay? Like, one of the nicknames for that is going to be like a stud. Now, that is not a particularly nice thing to be called, actually, because you're being compared to a horse or a cow. All right? It's, it might have a positive connotation in one sense, but like in another sense, it really isn't. Then we think about like other things that animals do, like eating. Okay. If anybody here has ever had a goldfish, one of the things you know about goldfish is that you have to be really careful about how much you feed them, because like if you overfeed them, their stomachs will explode. I think we actually used this example last class. My point, though, is that animals tend to deal with food fairly instinctually and fairly emotively. So, they will often eat out of this instinct of like they don't know when their next meal is going to come from. Animals, unlike people, don't ever diet or anything like that. They like eat what they have, and if they're full they might stop, but they're not going to say, oh no, I'm not going to eat any more ground beef because that's going to cause me like heart trouble. Like, animals don't think that way. And so very similarly to like the sex example, when you have somebody who overeats, who eats without thinking, don't we like maybe call them a pig? Okay, like there's like something animalistic about that. And so, to the extent that we are acting more based on instinct or emotion, Aristotle thinks that we are acting less than human. Okay. Now, it's still a power we have. Like, he's not saying emotions are bad, but he's saying emotions aren't what make us human because animals still have them. So, what does he think makes us human? And the thing he thinks makes us human are our logic, our ability to reason. Okay, he views us as rational, and rationality is really important to Aristotle. And so he thinks that's what separates us from the animals and from the plants. That's what gives us our power. And so the third soul for Aristotle, the soul that humans possess, is the rational soul. And by rational soul, we mean the ability to like overpower our emotions, overpower our instincts. We all have certain instincts. One of the things I would do right now in class is probably like throw an eraser at one of your faces. Okay, and if somebody throws an eraser at your face, what do you naturally do? You naturally close your eyes. Okay, you might also try to cover your face, but you close your eyes when something's like coming at you. But if any of you has ever played baseball or softball or football or anything where like a ball is coming at you, you know that the worst thing you can do is close your eyes. And so I remember, like, when I was playing Little League and, like, you're on this, like, step between, like, T-ball and Little League, like, coach's pitch. And I remember, like, the balls would come at me and I would be standing there with my bat and close my eyes. And, of course, I was a terrible ball player because you can't get a hit with your eyes closed unless it's by luck. Right. My son, on the other hand, is a hockey goalie, and he sits there and things are coming at him all the time, and he's, like, keeping his eyes open and, like, moving around and trying to, like, knock stuff away, but, like, he doesn't flinch. Okay. We can train ourselves not to flinch. Okay. And you can do that just by thinking about it. So if I were to say, all right, I'm going to throw this eraser at you right now, don't close your eyes, you could leave your eyes open. Okay. Your instinct, you can override that. Just like we do, and I was talking about, like, eating too much before, we do that with food too, right? Okay. Like, we can diet. We can say, all right, I'm not going to eat a slice of cake, or I'm not going to eat this thing, even though I'm hungry, even though I want to. We do the same thing with sex. You might have a sex drive, but that doesn't mean that it's okay to go out and, like, rape somebody. Okay. It's like, just the fact that you have the desire doesn't mean that your rationality can't overrule that desire. Okay. We maybe don't have, like, an emotive basis for being monogamous, okay? At least men certainly don't, right? Okay? If one of the things that drives us as animals is to reproduce, like, one boy can get 10 different girls pregnant, all right? And so, like, the drive to monogamy is really, like, a rational one, not an emotive one. Do you see where I'm going with this? Okay. In all these areas, what makes us human is our ability to be rational. And so, for Aristotle, ethics is based not on how we feel, but on how we think. What he comes up with is something we are going to call the golden mean. And it is easiest to understand this with an example. So I'm going to give you a fairly simple, straightforward example, which is one of the first ones that Aristotle talks about. Okay. If you take a virtue, okay, that is, like, a positive thing that, like, is part of our, like, what it means to be a good person. Okay. If you take a positive virtue, like bravery, what Aristotle will say is that bravery is the midpoint between two extremes. Okay. On one extreme, you have, like, cowardice, right? Okay. But on the other side, there's a different extreme. Now, it's less common than cowardice. Okay. Cowardice is the one that we have a word for. Right? The other side, it's maybe like foolishness or brashness, or so here's the example. Okay. If you are going down the street, okay, and suddenly you come across a house on fire, if you are a coward, okay, you are afraid, okay, you just run away. You don't want to be anywhere near the fire. Okay. You don't do anything to help you, you just run, okay, to get yourself away from there. On the other hand, if you're brash, okay, if you're foolhardy, let's say, maybe you run in to look for people into the burning building. Now, the presumption here is that you are not trained to do this, okay? You are not a fireman. You are, like, just some college kid, like, walking down the street. You don't have any equipment. You don't have anything. Okay. Now, if you run into the burning building and, like, you pull out, like, two toddlers who were, like, in there by themselves, is the newspaper going to call you a hero? Yes. Okay. are firemen going to call you a hero? And the answer is actually they're going to be no. Okay, because you're not trained to do this. What happens if you run into a burning building and then you get stuck in there? Okay, now the firemen not only have to find those like two toddlers who were in there, but they also have to find you. Okay. So we have these like two extremes. So what is bravery? Well, part of the problem in answering this is that it's very circumstantial, right? What's brave for you is maybe like calling 911 and calling the fire department. Okay. But that would be different than what's brave for somebody who's like trained in fighting fires. Okay. If you're a fireman and you run away from a fire, okay, you're definitely cowardly. Okay. But okay, you can be trained to become brave. And the way you become brave, or the way you develop any virtue, according to Aristotle, is through practice. So you can be trained on how to like run into that building and help people. But a fireman can also be foolhardy. Okay, there are fires that happen where like the building is like gonna collapse any second now. If you're a fireman and you run into a building that is 30 seconds away from collapsing, you're now being foolhardy. Like you're not going to be able to do anything. You're not going to be able to save anybody, and you're going to die because the building is going to collapse on you. So even for like it might for you as a like untrained college student, it might be the case that it is not brave to run into the building. And for a fireman, it might be the case that it is brave to run into the building. But for everybody, there are also times where it's foolhardy to run into the building. All right? In other words, okay, the golden mean is this midpoint somewhere between these two extremes. And Aristotle says we get this not by how we feel about it, okay? It is, should you be afraid of running into a burning building? And I think the answer is yes, okay? Even if you're, like, trained, you should be afraid. Like this is a dangerous situation that you are putting yourself in. But you are not just like in a dangerous situation. You are like, you have the skills, okay? You have the training to fight this fire, to go in and rescue people, to like put your life on the line. And that is a rational choice that you have made. So instead of like running into the building like a chicken with your head cut off or running away, you have been trained to do this thing. You still feel the fear. You still have that emotion. Because if you didn't, then there's something wrong with you. But you are able to like tamp down that emotion and instead like put your training to good use. And Aristotle thinks this is going to be true of every single thing that you consider to be like a positive attribute. So, another example he would maybe write about is generosity. Okay. Now, somebody can be really stingy and like not give anything and be cheap. Okay. But somebody else can like always be like giving everything. And the problem with like, let's say charity, okay, so like you never help anybody, or you're always helping everybody. If you're always helping everybody and you don't leave anything for yourself, eventually you're going to end up impoverished. And so what generosity is like giving the right amount at the right time. And that's different for everybody. What you might be doing in terms of, what you can give as a college student, and what I might be doing as somebody who has a job and who has like, more disposable income than most college students do. What would be generous for me and what would be generous for you are maybe different things. And so Generosity has to be rational, but it also has to be based on circumstances. So, how do we develop any of this? And the way we develop this, according to Aristotle, the way we become basically like good people is through practice. Okay? It's not going to come to us naturally, because naturally we're almost always inclined towards one extreme or the other and not towards the golden mean. Okay? Just like the fire department has to go through training, has to go through practice, okay? Or just like, it takes practice as an athlete to say, I'm not going to close my eyes when the pitcher like throws a ball at my head. I'm going to keep my eyes open and like swing the bat, okay? That takes rationality, right? And it takes practice and it takes repetition. And so Aristotle doesn't think we're going to be natural at this. He thinks that we need the practice. And we need to do it until it becomes part of who we are. So that what we do automatically. And he says that that's how we develop virtue. And the more we do that, the more we turn into, and we've all had this experience of like, we know somebody, very frequently like an older person, I think, who like seems to live a good life. We want to be like them. We want to I remember for me it was my grandfather. And my grandfather was like this great man, and I wanted to be like him because even though he wasn't perfect, he always seemed to know what to do. He seemed to have like the answers. Now, I'm not saying that anybody has all the answers, but like what Aristotle says is the way we train ourselves, the way we find out like how to achieve this virtue, how to live the good life, isn't just practice, but it's finding somebody who we can emulate, okay? Who we can say, all right, like if you ever see those like bumper stickers, like what would Jesus do? That's actually the idea here, okay? Like what would like this virtuous person do? Let me do the same thing. And eventually, if we do that enough, Aristotle thinks we ourselves will become virtuous, and then other people can start using us as a model. Okay. There's a lot more I could say about Aristotle, but we need to move on. So the next person we're going to talk about is Immanuel Kant. And Kant is 2,000 years or more after Aristotle, okay? Kant was German, and he was living in a period of time right after the religious wars that followed the Protestant Reformation. Okay. Before the Protestant Reformation in Europe, if there was a question about ethics, it was really going to be a question for most people about morality, because everybody was Christian. Okay? And to be Christian at that time in Europe meant that you were Catholic. And so, if there were any questions, the church had the answer. You could go to the Pope, and the Pope would tell you. But with the Protestant Reformation, we have this, breakup of, Protestant countries and Catholic countries in Europe. And there are wars, but there's also this disagreement about, what is the right thing to do. And Kant said, we have these, religious ideas, but what if we're not the same religion? Okay, how do we know what is right or what is wrong based on just logic? And so he is trying to come up with a rule that you can always follow no matter what. Okay. The rule he comes up with is called the categorical imperative. And you can be very thankful that you're not reading Kant right now, because this is the most boring thing I have ever read. And, students hate it because he's really repetitive, and I don't know. Something about, writing in German and translating into English. There's, Kant is tough. Okay. But the categorical imperative is actually a really simple and in some ways a really useful tool. Kant says, don't act in such a way that you could wish everyone else act that way. Okay. What does that mean? Well, I think a good example here is a bus. Okay. If you are like from a big city, okay, and you have like used public transportation, if you get on a bus in New York City, okay, sometimes they have these like double buses, and they're sort of weird actually. Like there's two buses and then this like rubber thing in the middle so that it can like turn a little bit. And those buses, like you're supposed to get on the front, okay, and you like give your Metro card in at the front and you pay your bus fare. But there's also doors at the back of the bus. Not like a school bus where, like, you know, you have that door at the back for emergencies, but rather like, you know, doors with steps, okay? So when the bus stops, you're supposed to get on in the front and, like, pay your fare, okay? But some people just hop in the back, okay? Because the bus driver, is he gonna, like, stop the bus? Like, should he? Maybe, okay? But, you know, if you're driving around in, like, Queens or Brooklyn and like the bus stops and like somebody like hops on the back while other people are getting off and like takes a seat and doesn't pay, if you try and like call the police like you're supposed to and say like this guy like didn't pay his fare and you need to arrest him, like it's gonna take so long and be so complicated that no bus driver is gonna do that. So every now and then some people like hop in the back of the bus. Now, the categorical imperative says, act only in such a way that you could wish everyone else do the same thing. But if you're getting on a bus, okay, and you're not paying the fare, presumably, you want the bus system to work because you want to take that bus somewhere. You're not just getting on the bus to say, oh, hey guys, okay, you're getting on the bus because you want it to take you to another stop. The problem is that the way the bus system or any sort of transportation system works is that people have to pay into it. If everybody did what you did, if everybody got on the back of the bus, if everybody snuck on without paying, there wouldn't be a bus system. So you're not actually okay. Like, maybe you're like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, cheat the bus system right now, okay? And, like, you know, what does it matter? They have plenty of money. But what the categorical imperative says is, sure, they have plenty of money because most people pay their fares. But if you don't pay their fare, you're basically saying you would be okay if no one paid their fare. But if there was nobody paying a fare, there would be no bus. And so the categorical imperative basically says, like, you'd have to be okay with everybody else doing it. Okay. There are very few things where we're like, all right, I'm going to be okay doing the bad thing, okay, the thing that, like, is against the rules, the thing that is against the law, and I'd be okay if everybody else did the same bad thing. Okay, most of us are not okay with that. So, like, maybe you're like, all right, I'm going to, like, you know, kill my uncle to, like, inherit money. Well, that's all well and good, but by killing somebody else, you're tacitly saying that you're okay if somebody kills you to inherit money, and presumably you're not okay with that. And so, in a lot of ways, this, like, categorical imperative only act in such a way that you could will everybody else to do the same thing is basically saying, don't be a hypocrite, okay? Don't act in a way that you're like, oh, like, do what I say, not what I do, all right? Kant says, like, that's a problem. However, there's another problem with this. And it's something that, you know, it's unfortunate Kant is German because, of course, the example I'm going to give you is like a pretty typical German example. But if you're Hitler, okay, and you say, all right, let me kill a Jew right now, are you okay with everybody else killing a Jew too? And if you're like a really dedicated Nazi, the answer has to be yes. Okay? Because, like, you believe that, like, Jews are subhuman and need to be exterminated, and if you believe that and you follow the categorical imperative, you're okay if everybody else also exterminates Jews. So you're like, sure, go right ahead. Like, make my job easier. But that is obviously, at least obvious to me, not moral. You're not a hypocrite, okay? Like, if you're a true believer and you're like, we need to like exterminate X people from the earth, okay? And you're willing to go ahead and do that. That doesn't make you a hypocrite. But that doesn't mean you're good. And so Kant, the problem with the categorical imperative is that it works if people have like good morals, good ethics. Okay. But if somebody actually wants or desires something evil and they're okay with everybody else desiring that evil, that makes the categorical imperative not work, because then it's just like, all right, well, you're being consistent, but you're being consistently evil. Now, this was way before the Nazis, so nobody said that to Kant as an example. But other philosophers did point out to him, okay, there's a problem here, dude, because what if somebody wants something, like, that is evil? And he's like, all right, I'm going to give you a second categorical imperative. And a second categorical imperative is only, like, treat people as an end in themselves and not only as a means to an end. Now, he doesn't say that, like, we can't ever view other people partially as a means to an end, right? So, like, just as an example, like, if you go into a restaurant and you order food from, like, the waiter or waitress, part of you is treating that waiter or waitress like a person to bring you your food, okay? So like, you are treating them as a means to something else, okay? But presumably, you're not going in there and, like, treating them like a slave either. You recognize that that waiter or that waitress is somebody who is, a person and not just a waiter or waitress. So you treat them like you should, at least, treat them like as a person, like be kind, okay? You're not just using them to get your food. And so Kant says basically, like, don't use other people. Here's the problem. All right. That's also a really good rule most of the time. But go back to the Nazis. If you're a Nazi, do you think that Jews are people? And at least some Nazis would say, no, they're like subhuman. They're like, something that needs to be exterminated. And so they're going to use that to justify. Okay. That's very, my computer did something strange. And if there's a thumbs up on your screen, I don't know where that came from. Okay. But they're going to do something to justify like the fact that the people that they are killing are not human. Okay. We did the same thing in the United States with slavery. Okay. How do you justify slavery? Well, you say, well, these aren't really humans. They're something else. Okay. They're like not fully human somehow. And so, and actually slave owners did this all the time. They would justify slavery by saying, well, they couldn't take care of themselves. Okay. Like, they need me to, like, provide them housing and food, and, like, they're just incapable of doing that. And so, it's fine that I use them as slaves because, like, they're not really human beings the way I am. And so Kant's categorical imperative, even though it's really good to, like, for most of the time, okay, it's like really good to say, all right, like, I wouldn't be okay with other people doing this, so I'm not going to do it either. Sort of like the golden rule, right? Like, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But the problem with any of his iterations of the categorical imperative is that no matter what, they don't really account for people who are bad actors, for people who are, going to do something evil. Okay. So if I sound down on Kant, it's because I want him, after all the suffering I had to do to read his work, okay, I want his idea to work, and it seems to be flawed to me. Okay. There's a third, there's a lot more than that, but there's a third philosopher we're going to talk about, who's an ethicist, and his name is John Stuart Mill. And what Mill is famous for is called utilitarianism. And I'm going to guess, actually, that most of you probably fall into his group of thinkers when it comes to ethics, okay? What Mill said we have to do is always do the greatest good for the greatest number. And so, like, our obligation is to, like, do the most good we can for the largest number of people we can. And I think a lot of us make decisions that way. Okay, there's this famous problem called the trolley problem, and it's a thought experiment. Okay, the thought experiment is this. There's, a trolley going down the track, and there's a split in the track, okay? And so the trolley could go to the left or to the right. And if it goes to the left, there are 5 people on the track, and they're all going to be killed by this trolley. Okay. If it goes to the right, there's 1 person on the track, and that 1 person is going to be killed by the trolley. And so if you can pull a lever to send the trolley one way or the other way, which way are you going to pull the lever? And almost everybody says, okay, I'm going to pull the lever so that the trolley only kills 1 person as opposed to 5. Because, it's better to save 5 people than it is to save 1 person. And I totally get that. Okay? And that is a very utilitarian answer, because it's like the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, it's 5 people alive as opposed to 1 person alive. So we're going to save the greatest number of people. However, there's a bit of a problem here too, because one of the examples that always comes up with the trolley problem is, let's say you're a doctor, okay, and there has been an accident, okay, make it a trolley accident for that matter, okay, and you have 6 patients, okay, 1 of them has a broken arm, okay, 2 of them have lungs that are damaged and need lung transplants. 1 of them has a damaged heart and needs a heart transplant. 1 of them needs a liver transplant. 1 of them needs, kidneys. Okay, because all of those things got damaged in this accident. Okay. Now, if you use exactly the same reasoning that you used in the trolley problem, and you said the greatest good for the greatest number, well, why don't you harvest the organs of the guy with a broken arm? Because if you harvest his organs, you kill 1 person, but you save the other 5. We're not okay with that. Okay? We're okay with rerouting the track to kill 1 person to save 5. But we're not okay with harvesting a healthy person's organs to save 5 people who are dying. In other words, saying the greatest good for the greatest number doesn't always work, because even if we might be right in one instance, we're wrong in the other instance. And there's lots of examples that we, in our society have. So, in the American criminal justice system, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. In other words, we want you to be able to, get away with a crime instead of putting an innocent person in prison. Okay? It is more important to us, constitutionally speaking, even though it doesn't necessarily work this way in practice, it is more important to us constitutionally speaking to not imprison or punish somebody who is not guilty than it is to let somebody who is guilty go. And so, utilitarianism would say the opposite. They would say, well, even if we lock up a few people who really don't deserve it, if it makes society safer, that's better. Okay? But that's not what our constitutional system says. And You maybe are even saying to yourself, well, I'm okay if we lock up a few innocent people so long as, like, all the criminals get locked up too. And maybe you're willing to say that until you are the innocent person who's locked up. And then you're like, oh, this is not fair. Okay. And so we are not always okay with the greatest good for the greatest number. We tend to make a lot of decisions that way. Okay. But one of the arguments I would make is that we make a lot of decisions that way based actually on emotion. Okay. We are like, all right, I would rather save the 5 people than the one person. And, like, we feel an emotion that way. Or we feel an emotion when we're talking about the patient, okay? So, like, the harvesting of the organs, we feel a different emotion, and so we change our minds. And that's why, like, I really have a lot more respect ultimately for Aristotle, because even if the other philosophers have really good ideas and, like, they can be useful in some circumstances, the focus that Aristotle brings to rationality and to circumstance, so that there's a different rule based on, like, your like training, your place in life, your responsibilities, so on and so forth. And we know that that's true. Like, we know that about food, right? What the number of calories that you should eat if you're 80 pounds is different than the number of calories you should eat if you are, like, 250 pounds. Okay. What you need as somebody who, like, is not an athlete and is, sitting in a lab all day is different than what you need if you're, like, training to run a marathon. And so circumstances and where that golden mean are seem to be a lot more important than coming up with a rule that always works, like the categorical imperative or like utilitarianism and the greatest good for the greatest number. Because the greatest good for the greatest number can justify a lot of bad things. That's kind of what we have time for in talking about ethics. I know that there's a lot more I can say, and you might have some questions. Feel free to email me any questions you have, but, like, that's what we have. So 2 days from now, I will be doing you another video. That will be filmed, I believe, at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. So I will see you then. Have a great day.